OCD. I would take
Hmm.
two.
Take two. Start over. We also had an aggressive cat interruption.
Oh, wow. That's my favorite kind of aggressive interruption, other than me just fumbling over my words. So, this week on Purely OCD, we are going to be continuing our discussion on relationship OCD. And we're going to be sort of finishing up with a discussion on exposure and response prevention within this subtype. So, we've been talking about obsessions and compulsions to sort of gear us up for this dialogue. And so I guess maybe a good starting point if somebody's in your office, and obviously it's going to depend on how relationship OCD is presenting, right? And as we've talked about in the obsessions episode, it can present in so many different ways. But if somebody comes in and their main concern, if we keep it broad enough, is like, what if I end up with the wrong person? Right? Like what if this person that I am currently in a relationship is the wrong person for me? Where do you typically start with somebody?
Well, usually we would start with just acknowledging, and I think we've talked about this in the last episode, but really honing in and really just really hammering it in that there's no certainty in any of this, right? That there's no right partner. So essentially you will marry the wrong person. Right? So making sure they have a very good grasp on that before we kind of dive into exposures, I guess. That itself, I guess, is the first exposure, basically.
That's such a good point. And that's where that article that you're referencing, and I know we have to have spoken about it in one of the last two episodes, but why you will marry or why you're going to marry the wrong person by Alain de Botton on the New York Times, or in the New York Times, is in and of itself a very, well, it's part exposure and also oddly grounding, because it's saying, hey, there is no certainty and you have to accept that. And so it kind of gears you up for, okay, like this is why I'm going to accept uncertainty. It doesn't make sense to do anything else. And maybe makes the whole process of doing exposure, like it's clearer as to why.
Yeah, exactly. And then from there, I guess we go into like what triggers that person to have this feared thought come up of them not being the right person. And, from that, the information we gather there, then building out the exposures. So it might be they have this fear of, well, they're not the right person because when we argue, they don't say, I'm sorry. Okay. I don't know. I was just pulling that out of.
That's a good one. That's a good one. Like
they don't say it
apologize, or they don't say it right. We hear that a lot. Like they apologize, but it's not.
Yeah, they didn't really mean it.
Right, they weren't sincere enough in the way that they presented the apology. But yeah, or where they don't apologize in the way that I want them to. That's a great example.
Right. And so then that person might do compulsions where they're talking about it to other people, asking for reassurance, just to kind of give reference from last episode. They might also be asking the partner excessively, like, I need you to say you're sorry.
Yep.
Like,
and I need you to, and no, I need you to tweak that word. This is still not good enough.
Yeah. They might actually go to couples therapy too, as a compulsion to kind of get them to be the right partner, if you will. So the first exposure might be removing all of the reassurance that we're getting from others, or, if they're asking their friends, does your partner do this? It's like, yeah, we're going to limit that or remove it entirely. But also validating the person, hey, of course you want your partner to say they're sorry. And they're not always going to be the perfect partner. The end.
Right. Well, and that's the difference. I think that this is where assurance or just normalizing
Yeah.
versus reassurance is so important. Saying, yeah, no, it's completely reasonable that you want your partner to
Yeah, yeah.
acknowledge where where their shortcomings are, and at what point does it become excessive that you're asking all these people whether or not it's okay that they say sorry in this particular kind of way, or um and this, I love that you brought this example because you can see so clearly how problematic that's going to be in relationship, right? If
Yeah.
you're constantly with your partner going like, you're not saying sorry, right? And they're trying. Like, that's not good. Like, I know that as a partner, if my husband did that to me all the time, I'd be like, well, shoot, I'm trying really hard. And like that's going to put a strain on the relationship.
Well, and sometimes we're not sorry. Just
Whoa.
throwing it out there. Sometimes we're imperfect, and sometimes right now it's also with OCD, there's that rigidity of like, I need the sorry, I need it now.
Yes.
And maybe that person's in the heat of the anger and they're not ready to say it. And that's half the problem, is that the person's requesting that they do it now when they want it. And the sorry's coming off ingenuine.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. And so having the space to tolerate, okay, well, maybe they should be saying sorry now and they're not. Maybe
Right.
that does mean something about my relationship, allows for the space for there to be repair, for
Yeah.
there to for all everyone involves emotions to like spike and then subside. But if we're not willing to drop all of the compulsive asking or the insistence that the sorry come in a certain package at a certain timeline, um that that's I, that's the response prevention ultimately.
Right. Yeah, that's it.
That's so there are exposures all the time when you're in a relationship if you have this fear of like maybe they're not the right person. Um and really what we're looking at is that response prevention part and whether or not you're following up with a lot of compulsions trying to make sure that they're the right person.
Yeah, exactly. Um, so maybe that wasn't the best example, I guess, that I gave for an active exposure, but
No, but I think it was a great example. And I think
that's like a more complex one though. And I
mm,
think the the reality is the relationship OCD has a caveat around, and I've said this before, is like with every variation of type of OCD, there are different caveats. And with relationship OCD, Lauren had talked about it just a few minutes ago, is like the assurance versus reassurance is like part of relationship OCD is that we're going to have to navigate that. Of course, we want a sorry and allow for imperfection. So a lot of it's kind of retraining and explaining to folks, what does a healthy relationship look like?
mm,
Getting your needs met, boundary, right, stuff like that.
mm.
Um, Not necessarily saying like, is this OCD or not? Because that's not going to be helpful to you.
No. But can I actually this set I want to go on a little bit of a
Yeah,
tangent
do it.
here.
Tangent away.
I love a good tangent, but I think this is where social media can be a real problem. And I don't think it's specific to this subtype, but there is so much black and white information about relationships online.
Mhm.
And so if you're trying to become better informed about like, okay, well, what does a healthy relationship look like? And then you go to Instagram, which I love Instagram. It's great. It's lots of wonderful information. Oftentimes it's like, well, if your partner does this, that's a red flag and you're done. Right. Like it's very, and
Right,
it's the
and
same with,
OCD is so rigid too, so it's like this is black, even more black and white, so there's no
right.
space for it one time to happen.
Right, exactly. And you see this, I think, come up a lot with parenting stuff,
Mhm,
with sexual orientation stuff, right? Like that there are
mhm.
some very like, well, this is this and that is that. And so people are concerned because they're hearing these ideas echoed that, well, you should always, always state your boundary. It's like, no.
Yeah.
No, actually, if you
You're
just
not the
statement,
only person in the relationship.
yes, right. It's not that black and white. We wish it was, because it's much clearer and simpler when things are so straightforward. Our brains like that.
Yeah.
But the reality is that it is much messier. And so it is funny because the exposure and response prevention here, so much of it is about allowing things to be nebulous, allowing for the relationship to be a dance rather than like an instructional, like, now you,
Pamphlet or book.
right, exactly. Like, I'm
Yeah.
imagining like a baking recipe. Okay, like you pour this much water in and then you add 2 eggs. It's not that. It's cooking, right? It's, oh, I'm going to add a little more salt here. I'm going to, not that you, obviously you can have recipes when it's not baking, but like the sort of baking cooking sort of
Yeah, baking is it's precision.
precise,
Yeah.
right? Because it's like a science, like
Yeah,
there's going to be chemical reactions and all of that, versus with cooking, there's a little bit more
flexibility. Ooh, I like
yeah.
this analogy. Yeah.
Thanks.
Relationship OCD is more like cooking versus baking.
Exactly. Yeah, you get me.
Uh-huh.
But in terms of like the more active exposures, which we can certainly do,
Mhm.
sometimes we talk about this in a lot of different subtypes, but sometimes just a good starting place is looking at the words that trigger you, like
Yep.
commitment, or I just knew, or he's the one, or right, like, when like these kinds of things these phrases tend to be very triggering
Yeah.
for people with relationship OCD. And so just having those on Post-its, or on your phone as an alarm that comes up every once in a while, can be really triggering and gives you that opportunity to practice not engaging, or, dropping rumination, dropping the reassurance seeking, all of that.
Yeah. Absolutely. And sometimes with relationship OCD, there can be like this, maybe not disgust, but like, oh, I don't want to kiss them, so that means they're not the right person for me. I'm not like feeling it or vibing, whatever the new language is around
Ooh,
it.
vibing.
Vibing. We're not vibing.
Mhm.
I'm so embarrassed if that's the wrong way of how to use it.
We're old.
Right. But to then say, okay, well, the exposure is actually when you aren't vibing, to give them a kiss,
Yeah.
hold their hand, lean into that
Yeah.
really uncomfortable feeling. That is what we're trying to go after here.
Yep. And then stop trying to figure out what that feeling means.
Always. Just
error, abort. Okay, so but here's another here's a sort of trickier question.
I could do it.
I love a good tricky question.
Mhm.
Is what about when there's, because this comes up a lot, I think, with sex.
Mhm. Good. I'm glad we're going there, because that's
Yep.
where I was kind of leaning towards, because it's a big topic. Yeah.
I picked up what you were putting down a little
Okay,
bit.
good.
And yeah, I think that I'm curious as to, because I have a lot of people who will come to me and say, hey, but I don't feel like it. And do I just force myself to have sex all the time? Is that what exposure looks like? And again, of course, black and white brains,
Yeah.
we love to put it into this either or category. I'm curious, and I'm happy to speak to this as well, but I'm curious as to how you navigate that.
Yeah, I think that one's actually trickier, because we want to talk about trauma too. If we're looking at percentages, I don't know the exact percentage, but if we're working with a female client, it's actually, I don't want to say it's common, but
It's not uncommon.
It's not uncommon. I don't know the stats.
Yeah.
But sometimes there is a little bit of trauma of some sort, right? Where I'm not going to force them to do a trauma exposure if it's gonna trigger, like, we're not working on trauma at the moment, right? So part of that is this dance with the client you are with, of what do you feel comfortable with? Like, if OCD weren't around, what what do you want in this relationship? How do you want it to look? And what feels safe for you? And then we make steps towards that.
Yep.
Because some people will avoid having sex for many, many months or even years because they don't want to feel that uncomfortable feeling of I'm not into it. So that
Right.
means, I mean, that can happen with other OCD topics. Like I don't want to have a pedophilia thought while having sex with my partner. So
Yes.
they're avoiding sex. So sex across the board. But in terms of the relationship stuff, yeah.
I think you've done a beautiful job of explaining the nuance there. I think the trauma piece is really, really important. And yet I think again, back to the education piece that you were talking about at the beginning and informing about how like what it is to be in relationship, also understanding that one is not always going to be in the mood, right? And
Right.
that you pointed out like there are two people in a relationship and it's a matter of like gauging, well, for me in this moment and best guess, I'm not suggesting we go down a rabbit hole here, but sort of like momentarily considering, is this about just a lack of excitement or is this about, like I really don't want to right now. And that would be a violation for me, whether or not you've actually experienced trauma. And I do think it comes up
Totally.
more often with people who have been raised and socialized as female, right? Because
Mhm.
because of the sort of power differential that exists and the cultural discussion around like, well, all men want is sex and like all of that
Right.
is
And you have to
is
please your husband and
exactly. So I think it's complex, but I think taking a moment to go, okay, what's my best guess? Is this, is am I avoiding this because it would be uncomfortable or I'm worried that if I'm not 100% on board, then I'm denying myself somehow
right.
or, am
Yeah, is this OCD? What am I avoiding? Is
yes,
this
exactly.
OCD?
Exactly, versus right now that genuinely would be a violation of me
Mhm.
taking care of myself because I'm not in a position where that would be safe for me.
Right. Or I'm just tired.
Or I'm just tired.
Mhm.
Or, you know, yeah.
Yeah, there's lots of different considerations, and that's why I think it's pretty specific to the person and the conversation we're having, but
Yep.
I'm so glad you brought it up because it is a really big one. It's like, no, it's not that black and white. We're not going to say, "Oh, we're gonna send you home with sex exposures." We may,
Yeah. Yeah. But
but
a lot of it too is like in if we go further with that, the response prevention piece is so important in the context of sex too. And so we're not going to say to your point like, oh well, you should go home and you should have sex this many times, right? Like
no,
or you should always have sex with your partner or like or you should never or what none of that's going to happen.
no.
But when we are suggesting that maybe you take that on in moments where you might otherwise avoid that, there's also the component of I like to talk about even approaching sex through a mindfulness lens and almost treating sex like meditation
Mhm.
because there's so many invitations to trying to figure out, am I interested in this right now? What about now? Oh, I'm not interested in this. What does this mean? And then you end up compulsing through the whole experience.
Yeah.
um so that's, I think, a factor to take into consideration as well.
Yeah, and for sure, and I think too, I've heard this come up of like that during sex, it should be this like profound, deep experience, and that's just
Mm,
not how sex operates.
no, sometimes
Um,
it is. I mean,
absolutely,
but
absolutely. But we can't have the expectation that it's all or nothing, right? Just because it's gonna give us an invitation to then ruminate for sure if we're having an expectation of anything, of like, "This is how it should be," and when it's
yeah,
somehow short of that, then we're like, "Oh, phew,
yeah, this is
that's
wrong.
clearly a reason to not be with this person."
Obviously.
Yeah.
I know I love that you bring it up, the fact that it's like it's not profound enough, or it's not hot enough, or it's not
Right.
exciting enough, or I'm not like I'm not climaxing sometimes. And that means it's whatever thing that we have an expectation around, uh, bringing that into the experience, and then letting, because it's hard not to have expectations, but at least having an awareness of the fact that you have the expectation going in allows you to be more thoughtful in how you respond when you realize that there's a divergence between what you're expecting and what the experience is.
Absolutely. And then maybe, shifting into exposures that are not as like, what if I'm in the right relationship, but maybe of, I don't like this one aspect of the way they look.
Mm-hmm. Like
I
what
don't
kind of
like the way their outfits are. So then the person's controlling how and what they wear and when they wear it. And obviously we can see how impactful that can be on the health of a relationship too. It's like, that's not going to go well.
No.
So the exposure would be allowing them to choose whatever they want to choose.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the response prevention piece. That's not the actual active exposure, but
Right. That's fair, but you could even add like an active exposure piece to that. So for instance, if your concern is that other people are going to judge your partner and therefore you, then you might acknowledge when you realize that your partner is wearing something that you don't like, hey, it's possible that people are going to negatively judge me based on what my partner is wearing.
right. Or maybe you're like around the house and you're like, oh, I'm having that strong reaction where I don't feel attracted to them because they're wearing this or their hair is this way. Hey, let's go to Starbucks together. I mean, I guess you could turn it into, is like, as long as we're willing, even if they say no, it's
Yes.
that willingness we're looking for of like, I'm going to lean into this in a way that makes you feel uncomfortable.
Totally.
So,
Yeah. Absolutely.
yeah. What else? We have a few minutes. I'm trying to think.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of whether, in terms of like more active exposures in the other realm, oftentimes we do things like have people watch romantic comedies or hang out with couples that you sort of admire or think have a perfect relationship. Sometimes
Yeah.
it can just be down to scrolling on Instagram, because there are going to be images of people come up that are like, oh wow, see, they have a perfect relationship. So sort of
Mhm.
anything that's going to invite you to get into the comparison mode, or to want to resolve that uncertainty would be, a good exposure. Video
Yeah,
blogs, that kind of thing.
absolutely. And to remember when we're assigning, say, like watching a rom-com, it's the practice of learning how to not engage in compulsions, right? That's what we're doing there. So it's not a free for all. Like, you don't just like say, oh, I'm going to watch this because it'll trigger me. It's like, yeah, we know that. It's actually the most important part is that we're practicing when we get triggered, we're not compulsing.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Most important part.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's tricky. They all are,
They
all
all
of
are.
all these dang subtypes are, so they have their own challenges that come with them. And one last thing I would like to nod to is that, because as you've said it before, like it's a table topic, right? Like that
Mhm.
people tend to discuss their relationships and to pick them apart. Like it's sort of culturally normative for us to do
Mhm.
this. And so um knowing that it's going to be easier with your friends or your family members potentially to get caught up in like some sort of co-rumination with them about whether or not you're in the right relationship,
Yeah.
um is, I think, is really important, because that's going to make you thoughtful going into those conversations and saying like, yeah, I don't know whether or not it's the right relationship, or like, and also being thoughtful about who can hang for those kinds of conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just add one more thing as well, though, really quickly,
Yes.
is sometimes people will avoid doing things like getting married, moving in together. So it would be just jumping into whatever we're avoiding, everybody.
Yeah.
Not letting OCD make the decision for us.
Yeah. If you're in that back and forth for a long time, at some point, it's down to making a choice.
It is. The choice is the exposure.
Amen.
Okay.
Well,
Should we wrap it up?
Yeah, and then the next time we'll be on to a different subtype. Stay tuned.
Stay tuned. And if you want to reach out to Lauren, she's at the Center for the Obsessive Mind. You can find her on Instagram at The Obsessive Mind. And then I'm Kelley, obviously, as we all know if you're listening. You can find me at The OCD Therapist on Instagram.
And she's also the director at the Center for OCD. And you can find her at her website, centerforocd.com.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Thanks for joining. See
All
you
right.
soon.